and welcome to this edition of Atlantic Council Front Page, our live ideas forum for global leaders. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm the Atlantic Council President and CEO. We're delighted today to be joined by Luis Alberto Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank, who will receive our highest honor on October 14th, the Atlantic Council Distinguished Leadership Award, which will be presented by former Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson. That comes after 15 years of President Moreno serving at the helm of the Inter-American Development Bank, and today is 2 weeks before he steps down. We hope this will salute President Moreno for an absolutely remarkable career. He joins a list of speakers on this platform that have included heads of state and government from Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and heads of international organizations, including NATO and the IMF. Today's episode is also part of our Leaders of the Americas series, which spotlights the most prominent leaders south of the US border. Previous guests have included Colombian President Ivan Duque, Guatemalan President Alejandro Giammattei, and interim President of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. The coronavirus pandemic has imposed a harsh human and economic toll across the world. As of last week, Latin America and the Caribbean have had more cases and deaths than any region in the world. 8% of the world's population is in Latin America, but 28% of the cases and 30% of the deaths have been in Latin America. In economic terms, Latin America is on a path to a deep economic contraction. So it's a very good time to engage Luis Alberto Moreno about the situation. He has been at the forefront of the COVID-19 response, and we're looking forward to hearing his views on how to avoid what experts fear could be another lost decade for the region if this period is not managed correctly. Before we get started, I would like to welcome lawyer, businesswoman, and philanthropist Adrienne Arsht to properly introduce Luis Alberto. Adrienne is the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Board of Directors, and she holds the extraordinary accomplishment of being the founder of not one, but two Atlantic Council centers, the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. Adrienne, it's my pleasure to pass this virtual floor to you.
Thank you, Fred. I'm glad to know that I'm centered. Well, 7 years ago, I met with you, Fred, to discuss my vision to launch a center that would challenge the world's perception of Latin America by positioning the region as a core partner in the transatlantic community. And today, this mission is even more imperative. As Fred mentioned, at the Council, we believe that we will shape the future by working alongside our friends and allies. President Moreno, you have been a friend of mine, of Jason's, and of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center since the very first day that the center came into being. Since you took over as president of the Inter-American Development Bank, you have made the IDB the principal source of long-term financing for Latin America and the Caribbean, while also providing specialized knowledge and technical expertise for social, economic, and institutional development. During these challenging times, the role of institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank and leaders committed to a prosperous hemisphere, leaders like you, Luis Alberto, are essential to ensuring the conditions for a thriving region for us all. Luis Alberto, you have been a strategic and visionary leader of the IDB, and we all thank you for your service in this critical role. As you step out of your role as president of the IDB, I would like to emphasize that you have a friend. Just call my name. And you have friends as well at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Atlantic Council at large. It's now my pleasure to turn to Jason Marsack, Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, to moderate this conversation.
Thank you,
Jason?
thanks, Fred. Thank you, Adrian. Luis Alberto, again, what an honor it is to have you with us today for this virtual Atlantic Council event. And I want to echo Adrian's words of friendship over the years with the organization and with the center, and the friendship for many years to come. It's also, before turning to you, it's my great pleasure to also announce that today's conversation marks the official launch of a new project between the Adrian Arch Latin America Center and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Securities Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative, in partnership with the IDB, that will map potential scenarios and provide recommendations for the region in shaping Latin America and the Caribbean's post-COVID future. So stay tuned for more on this project as we move forward. For all of you watching as well, please feel free to submit your questions. You can do so using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, Luis Alberto, let me turn to you with the first question. Recent statistics projections have shown, as we all know, unfortunately, the tremendous socioeconomic cost of COVID-19 for Latin America and the Caribbean. Upwards of 10% likely GDP contraction, over 5% increase in unemployment, 7% increase in poverty rates, with conversations now about the potential of, and I hesitate to even think about this, but the potential of another lost decade. My question for you to start off this conversation is, as president of the IDB, what do you see as the medium and long-term outlook for the region? And also, what might we not be thinking about as we talk about the region's medium to long-term outlook?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jason. And let me just begin first by saying hello to Adrian, even in this virtual way, and still remembering when she was thinking about doing something for Latin America at the Adrian Arch Center. I remember a dinner that you invited, amongst others, then former president of Spain, and you had a number of very distinguished people who look at the Atlantic Alliance, saying, you got to think about Latin America as you think of the Atlantic Alliance. And you had there, as I was saying, President Aznar and others. And I salute you for what you have been able to do. And of course, Fred, for everything that you do at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for the invitation. To your point, Jason, I think we are still today in the midst of the COVID crisis. You know well that Latin America holds about 8% of the population worldwide, but yet the cases of COVID in Latin America are about a third of those in the world. And what you find in Latin America is that the numbers of cases have remained growing. There's been ups and downs, like in many parts of the world, and a lot of this has to do with the speed of reopening in many countries. But it equally found a number of pre-existing both political and economic conditions. The economic conditions were that Latin America had not been growing for the past 5 years. If you look at just that 5-year period, was probably one of the lowest in the last 30 years. And the pre-existing political conditions were that people were in the streets, as you might recall, at the end of last year, certainly the second half of last year, because they were demanding largely not public services that they didn't have, but more importantly, the quality of those public services, be it in education, being in access to have public services that work, and that available to people. And those conditions are still there despite the confinement. And of course, governments have had to, at the tune of about 5% of GDP on average. There's countries that have done far more, like Peru, or say countries like Chile or Brazil, which have done upwards of sometimes even 10%. And others that don't just have the fiscal space to do more. Others like Mexico that have done very little, and yet every country is trying to wrestle with how to deal with the pandemic. What we know today is that the pandemic almost works like a forest fire. It comes and goes, but those ups and downs are really having a severe effect on our growth. And like you correctly mentioned, what we're seeing is perhaps a contraction of 10% this year. And that contraction this year, of course, is going to make that recovery even more difficult because, tax returns that you normally see this year are coming from what happened last year, but then the following year they will be lower. And so we're in a real conundrum, and, a lot will depend on how long this COVID pandemic remains. And of course, the secret will be, when do we have access to a vaccine, which you can begin to deal with the herd immunity. Now, there's a number of, to your point and to your question, there's a number of situations that have been generated because of this. One is, certainly as countries fight to control the spread of the pandemic, the spread of poverty, the spread of unemployment, and especially of increased debt, both to households, to governments, and to businesses, is huge. And so we're going to start to see the effects of this in the years ahead. And we're equally going to see the social dimensions of this, because one of the unintended consequences, of course, like it's the world over, the discussion of what happens to the younger generations, what happens with schools, how many essentially years are children going to lose because today their only way to be in school is through this medium. But unfortunately, in Latin America, not everybody has the luxury of having access to the kind of bandwidth that you need, and more importantly, to have the equipment to be able to deal with the possibility of doing distance learning. In fact, for the poor populations of Latin America, there's a recent report that we did on infrastructure that demonstrates that the income that it takes to many poor families can be anywhere from 15 to 20% the amount of money they would have to pay to just stay connected the way we are today. So
Luis, Alberto, on that point, I mean, there's some really incredibly worrisome reporting work that you've done at the IDB and others on specifically education. One of the big gains that Latin America has had is increased access to education that the poor families didn't have. And now students are forced to choice between paying their tuition bills or putting food on the table, and seeing already steep drops in education enrollment in universities in particular. So what does that mean moving forward? How do you recover from that? So you can't just turn the switch back on.
Well, on the one hand, what you're seeing is the drop in the investments in education, and of course the drop in enrollment. And no matter what happens, and people will make different projections, but I think we can safely say that we will be in some form of confinement or very difficult challenges for all of us in this COVID crisis, certainly through a good part of next year, and probably into part of 2022, which means that you have to begin to solve this collateral damage that, if you want, that is coming as a result. I think parents are going to be more forced to look at the education of their children, be more participant. I think there's a lot of hybrid systems that can be developed, things like charter schools that could be done more massively, especially for the higher quality education. The issue in education always is, it is not that you cannot get very good schools for 5,000 people. The challenge is to get it for 5 million people. And here, with the virtual realities that we have, that is an area that perhaps we should deepen on. At the same time, getting more connectivity to universities, and more importantly, beginning to understand better the demands of the labor market. If you look at any research done by people like Manpower and others that are in the business of placing people in business, still 50% of jobs cannot be replaced because there is a skills gap. Yeah. So we're going to have to be creative in ways of doing, very focused kind of skills programs associated with internships in companies. And we've actually done this in a number of countries in the IDB. And normally people that go through this have a much higher chance of finding a job. So these are some of the things that I think this kind of hybrid system that will evolve. And I sure hope that we can learn from it and make education better as a result.
In some ways, it's a matter of using this moment to reimagine the labor market, reimagine how the labor market could potentially function in the region. A quick question for you on follow up on collateral damage. What other collateral damage are you seeing that we are not talking about, not thinking about? And then also importantly, what could be the role of the United States in the international community? How can the United States, how can the international community better support Latin America at this crucial time?
Look, to me, the most important thing is probably going to be the debt issue. If you go back to the financial crisis over 10 years ago, at the time, Latin America had a lot of winds to its sails. In fact, most emerging markets did. A lot had to do with the good prices of commodities. Latin America is basically a commodities exporting type of region. And so you had essentially, the big appetite coming from Asia, especially from China, and the good price points that we saw at the time that essentially created a wealth effect in Latin America like we've never seen before. That allowed at the time to essentially get millions of people out of poverty to the tune of close to 100 million people either went out of poverty into middle classes, or we saw poverty rates significantly decrease. Yet, when the financial crisis came, the debt to GDP ratios were just under 40%, and we had essentially roughly a 0.5% fiscal surplus. That meant that there was truly a V-shaped recovery, and if you recall, most emerging markets really were the ones that brought back growth into the world economy, and that brought about growth in developed countries. The situation, of course, today is far different because the growth compression is more severe from some region to the next, but essentially there's a tremendous worldwide contraction, tremendous drop in trade. Latin American countries depend a lot on the volumes of those trade to grow their economies. And therefore, the debt, which was, like I say, roughly 40% back 10 years ago, it was close to 58% at the beginning of the year or end of last year. And we're projecting that it could be as high as 75% within the next 18 months. We're going to have essentially a debt overhang that if we look back at the decade of the 80s, it was really that debt overhang that was not solved until very late, which essentially meant a lost decade for Latin America. So that macro challenge is something that I think the United States is going to have to focus a lot on, because to make it very simple, COVID was not something that came because of poor macroeconomic management. We know it's an externality. And as such, you got to find a way to bridge this way of countries paying for that huge amount of debt buildup, which they have to do regardless to keep their economies, at least more than their economies, their jobs still together and dealing with the most vulnerable in all of our societies.
I think one thing you're saying as well is maybe for the international community at some point having a conversation about potential debt restructuring as we move forward in order to come out from underneath this crisis. Winston Churchill said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And I know it's hard to think about what could positively come out of COVID-19, but you've spoken a little bit about the smart import substitution. I'd like to ask you what you see as potential accelerants that COVID could create in the region insofar as Latin America's transformation. There's also a question here from actually the Estonia e-Governance Academy asking about digitization of the region. Could COVID actually help to accelerate digitization of the region?
Definitely, we have no choice but to accelerate. I think essentially the confinement has made it, has forced on all of us to accelerate something that was already out there. But we were not, participants. Like it's a second nature to us today after 6 months of confinement. So I do believe that the whole focus on digitalization across everything, not only across businesses, but especially across government services, across, let's call it a more paperless type of economy where you can do things digitally today in a variety of ways. And if you look at the core of what is essentially a social contract going forward, you need things in the area of health. And today you can do telemedicine, you can do portable medical histories, you can do a number of things where no matter where you're at, you can get better diagnostics. Equally, in education, we've talked a little bit about that, all the needs to have as a backbone, the digital systems to be able to improve the quality of education and to make it more massive, while at the same time, never losing the classroom experience. And in terms of, much has been written and talked about supply chains. But let me just for a minute go back in history. You might recall 20 plus years ago, there was a huge maquila factories across the US-Mexico border. And in very quickly, as China got into the WTO back now almost a little bit more than perhaps close to 20 years ago, you
Years
saw
ago,
a lot of that maquila disappear and go to Asia. But the reality is that real wages in China grew much faster than those in Mexico, or for that matter, Latin America. So there's been a convergence of those wage rates, which means that added to that and the logistics and the reality that we see today, many companies are looking to change their supply chain. So this is, as you've heard me say so many times, is the opportunity not just to think about making it in America, but to make it in the Americas. And that is, how do we create those supply chains across not only industry, but especially across services that can be incorporated and done within this hemisphere. I think that, added to the fact of what I call you mentioned the smart import substitution, there's many countries that produce food and there's many countries that import food, yet they could produce it. Good example, my country, Colombia, for that matter, Mexico, import a lot of grains, yet they can be produced in country. How do we do that? How do we create, a 21st century type agriculture of high precision with all of the public goods that are needed to get the productivity up? So these are some of the things that I see that equally will generate a lot of jobs and that will help us not in a jobless, but in a job type of recovery.
Luis Alberto, that's very smart. I mean, you look at nearshoring and this huge potential right now that exists for Latin America and the Caribbean as we're having to reconfigure a supply chain. So how does the region actually take advantage of those nearshoring opportunities, especially countries with which the United States, the U.S. has more free trade partners in Latin America than in any other region? I want to follow up and ask you, the COVID-19 was a shock that nobody, of course, anticipated, and frankly, underestimated the magnitude of the implications of COVID-19. And we, of course, have to brace ourselves for the next potential shock. So I want to ask you, in addition to COVID-19, what keeps you up at night? What worries you when you think about the region and where the region might go in the next couple of years? And what do you think we should be doing now to prepare for that?
Well, look, I definitely believe that the one shock that has been knocking at our door for some time is climate change. And if anybody has any doubt, just go to California. I had the privilege of going to visit my children, my grandson especially, a couple of weeks ago. And I was in Lake Tahoe, and I don't forget looking at, even though how removed we were from the fires, just feeling the smoke, not being able, this dark cloud overhanging the lake and everything. That really made me think and started looking at statistics. The amount of forest destruction in California between this year and last has grown tenfold. Equally, it's been happening as well in the Amazon. So all of a sudden, we got to get very, very serious about climate change because, it's happening quicker than we anticipated. And I think one of the most important things today is to have more science-based solutions. I think science is something that we all have been struggling to understand COVID. And that's why we all hear people like Dr. Fauci and others, and we want to learn more about. And, I was very bad in biology, and I've tried to go back and understand some of the basic situations that have created this virus. But it's equally true for climate change. And so I think that for Latin America, having 40%, for instance, of the biodiversity of the world, even being largely a clean energy kind of producer, 70% of the power in South America is all hydro. And yet, all of these implications can have tremendous effects, even on droughts that will, deplete some of the many dams that we have. And at the same time, really push on renewables. That's something that we have been doing in the bank for now a number of years. But the reality is that the climate change agenda and the consequence of that is how we can do this growth coming out of COVID to be green growth, and how to position the kind of growth that we can do around things where you have natural capital as a form of investment, that you can price natural capital, that you can equally begin to do all of these changes in our carbon footprint. These are the kinds of things that the humanity, but Latin America especially, is going to have in front of it. It can be an opportunity, no question, but it can also, if not dealt well, be a tremendous challenge for our hemisphere.
Luis. I'm going to turn to Paul Dobriansky and ask our first question beside myself. But the climate change. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because look at Central America in particular, that's so vulnerable to climate change and the disproportionate effect that climate change has, especially on some of the region's most vulnerable populations. I'd like to ask you as well about your legacy, but I want to make sure I bring in Paula Dobriansky for a question as well. Paula, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jason, and good to see you virtually, Luis. My question is, under your leadership at the IDB, you invested in water, sanitation, hygiene in healthcare facilities, and that's a preventive measure in dealing with pandemics and in dealing with infectious diseases. What other kinds of preventive measures should be taken going forward, and what's the role of the private sector? I'm really good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
No, thank you very much, Paula. This is a hugely important point, and one of the big things that we need to focus today is to remember, water and sanitation, as Paula correctly puts it. If you look at many of the tropical diseases, many of the different diseases, they are all animals, but most of those animals comes from insects that are basically come from served waters, from lack of sanitation. And this is why it's no surprise that even though COVID affects all of us, it affects all of us differently. The poorest, as we have seen not only in the United States, but equally in Latin America, get the most severe effects of COVID, not only economic, but equally health-wise. And so we all talk about something that is natural to us here in the United States, wash your hands. The reality is that many places you don't have water to wash your hands, or if you do, it's limited and not necessarily clean. So that as an example. For the water and sanitation systems to be better, you got to begin looking at where your watersheds are, how to protect watersheds. There's amazing watersheds in Latin America that unfortunately have been depleted, largely because people are populating those watersheds or because they're too close to them and they have not been sufficiently protected. We've done programs to begin to do that with a community-based type of approach. Equally, sanitation has improved, but the reality is that there's other areas of water and sanitation is the quality of piping that requires constant investment, and wastewater treatment is something that is still very low, and again, is a source of disease. So these are the things that I think are fundamental. They are the source of many of the tropical diseases that we have. Things like malaria and others, all of them come from one way or the other here. And who knows how these different diseases morph into something different.
Ambassador Dobriansky, thank you so much for that question. As everyone knows, Ambassador Dobriansky on the Atlantic Council Board of Directors, also Vice Chair of our SCOCROP Center for Strategy and Security. Luis Alberto, we're just about time, but just an important last question for you. After you're leaving the IDB in 2 weeks, after 15 incredible years of leadership at the bank and 15 incredible years of improving the lives of people all across the region, what would you say, it's probably hard to do in just one minute here, what would you say is your most important legacy as you look back over the last 15 years?
Look, I could point to many things. I think the fact that we were able to concentrate around, how the changes in needs in our hemisphere, going from a time when I came in that there was abundant supply of resources. People believed at the time that probably multilateral institutions were not needing, to the financial crisis, to where we're at today. But things around gender, things around climate change, things around digitalization, these were all big agendas that we took on. Things about cities, which we've spoken with you a number of times. But to me, at the end, institutions are about the quality of people that you bring in. Institutions, you're never successful, or you're only as successful as the people that are around you. And what I feel the proudest is that over the years, we were able to assemble one of the strongest teams there is. You deal with them all the time. This is what today I think is highly admired of the IDB. Plus the fact that we always understood, and I thought it was critical, that the IDB is not only a source of knowledge, that we, yes, provide financing, but financing to countries is basically a commodity. Reality is our value proposition is really around knowledge, and how we can use this platform to bring other players to plug in and to support and to deal with the many challenges our hemisphere has.
Well, thank you very much, President Moreno, and I see that knowledge every day in working with your incredible staff, the IDB, and this is part of our new Atlantic Council IDB project on mapping Latin America's post-COVID future. So on behalf of Fred, myself, Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today for this Atlantic Council front page at this critical moment, and thank you again for your friendship over the years and for your friendship in the years to come. I also want to remind everybody tomorrow morning there will be another Atlantic Council front page with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at 9:15 a.m. So please tune in for that as well. Again, Luis Alberto, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Paula and Adrian, and of course my good friend Fred. All of you, thank you, and have a great afternoon. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye.